Aurelio, why don't you start us off today?
Paskapoo Slopes, is this a compromise everybody can live with even though you voted against it?
Yes and yes. Our goal, of course, is to make sure that we represent the view of council, but also that we make things as good as they could possibly be. So the nature of the amendments today, some of them were very technical, but it put back in a pedestrian connection between the shopping on the east side of the proposal and the community of Bowness. That was very important, and the developer agreed that that was important. It also puts in a bunch of things around architectural controls, wildlife controls, making sure that the development is sensitive to the environment around it. What we passed today was certainly much better than what was before us last week. I think it could have been better yet, which is why I didn't vote on it. I think there's still a couple of things that could be tweaked on it, but council clearly said development is okay, and our job then was to make it the best possible development. Can we do it at the end? That way I can think about what to say. Okay.
So where does it go from here, Your Worship? Are you going to fine tune it, or are we going to go on to the development process?
No, there are. It's an interesting process from here on, because the Calgary Planning, the Calgary Planning Commission actually asked for additional authority over what we call the development permit stage. So from here, detailed design happens, architectural design happens, and there's going to be a lot of different approvals, more than there would be on a normal project, as we move forward.
Mayor, the decision on the inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginals, you felt that this was, finally the time to get this done?
Yeah, we have been quietly working on reconciliation issues, both with our neighbours in the Treaty 7 nations and with the urban Aboriginal population since I've been mayor. And these things are important. They matter. And we need to continue to remember that the great promise of our community, the promise that every single person in our community has the opportunity here to live a great life, is not a promise that is always met for Aboriginal populations, for our First Nations brothers and sisters and our Métis brothers and sisters. And so it's important, I think, for us to take a symbolic step as the City Council saying, look, this stuff matters to us. Right in front of me, right here, is a monument in front of our council chambers to people who are doing great work with Aboriginal communities, the winners of the David Crowchild Memorial Award. And it's important for us to live that in our hearts and our work every day. In terms of the inquiry on murdered and missing Aboriginal women, this has sadly been politicized. But the fact remains that there is a group of people in our society who are victimized, who are brutalized, who are murdered at much higher rates than anyone else. And it's important for us to recognize that's not normal and that's not desirable. And if there is any group in our society, that is victimized in that way, then it's our job as human beings, as citizens, and as policymakers to do something about it. And I'm very, very pleased the Council agreed today that we will add our voices to the long, long list of people calling for an inquiry into this.
Is there more that the city can do besides a symbolic gesture and adding the approval? Is there any type of action that the council can take as well?
There's a number of real legitimate things we need to do, and I don't want to say that symbolism is not necessarily a bad thing. Symbols can be very, very important. The fact that I start almost all of my public addresses now by reminding people about the provenance and the history of the land on which we stand doesn't make a difference, but it helps to bring the issue back into the hearts and minds of people, and I think that's important. But at the same time, there are very specific things we need to work on as a community. There are many, many examples. I'll give you just one. As part of the Calgary Poverty Reduction Strategy, we have a special table specifically focused on poverty in the Aboriginal community. And when we did that originally, I was a bit wondering whether the issues that are faced in the Aboriginal community are the same as the issues faced by others, and shouldn't we be working on the same poverty solutions for everyone. But I was convinced that the cultural aspects and the fact that poverty is at such a higher rate within that community meant that we needed to take a special focus on it. So a lot of our work in terms of poverty reduction, like community hubs, like giving people access to information and services that they require early in the process, like prevention of social issues like homelessness before they happen, are particularly acute for Aboriginal people, need to be done in a language-specific and a culturally appropriate way. So those are the sorts of things that we continue to work on. But our goal has to be that everyone in the community shares in the prosperity of the community.
I need to ask, sorry, you go.
just change the subject. There's been some ugly incidents involving taxi drivers and fares, and you're going to be discussing some of these stiffer bylaws. So could we get a comment on what's happened and how this might mitigate that situation?
Sure. You know, this is really one of those situations where we have to remind ourselves that what makes this community work is the fact that we look after each other. And there have been some very disturbing incidents, including one where we just had an arrest today, I believe, on people not treating taxi drivers as part of the community, as human beings. And this is a big problem. And while there are certain things we can do around fines and rules, and there are certain things we have done to increase safety in cabs, particularly the use of cameras in all taxis. That's safety for the passenger and the driver, by the way. It goes both ways. There's a passenger bill of rights and a driver bill of rights. Those things are very important, and we have to do them. But what's even more important is for us to remind everyone to respect one another. And that I don't care how drunk you are, I don't care how much you want that Big Mac before you go home at 3 in the morning, you treat people like human beings. And I think it's important for us to all remember that.
And do you think that's damaged the city's reputation because that video and that story went viral?
No, I don't think it has, because the reaction to it was universal condemnation. And I think people really actually saw that's kind of cool that all of the city, regardless of your political stripe or where you come from, have universally condemned that kind of behavior. That said, I don't want to see any more of these.
One last question in front.
Go ahead.
I need to ask a question of something off the consent agenda. The fire department is very concerned about unfunded fire stations and other projects. What are your thoughts on a stable source of funding?
We're going to be talking a lot about fire in the fall as the results of the zero-based review come in. And there are two issues here. The first is capital funding for fire halls, which is actually not bad. We're getting the ones built that need to get built. We've got a work plan for that. However, when we look at the offsite levy bylaw that's coming back in the fall, which has to do with how much developers are paying for these things, I expect there to be a very good discussion around fire halls in particular. The other question is operationally. Are there ways we can save money on the fire department? Because the challenge we have is as we are building out kind of lower density neighborhoods, you know, we just approved the Haskayne ASP, which is going to be a beautiful neighborhood. But just because it's geographically isolated, it's going to need its own fire hall. And there is no way that the property taxes of the people who are in that neighborhood are ever going to cover the costs of that fire hall. And so we have to be very, very thoughtful on how do we do this smarter? How do we have fire halls covering more ground? As building codes have changed, we found that a lot of the work that firefighters are doing is less about fighting fires and more about other community safety issues. So this autumn, when that zero-based review comes back, is going to be time for us to have a very serious community conversation about the level of fire protection we expect and deserve and what we're willing to pay for. Okay, now you want me to try and talk about complicated amendments en français?
Exactement.
Ce serait un peu difficile, mais j'essayais.
OK, parfait. En français, 16 amendements, ça passe quand même. On voit ce que c'est. Est-ce que ça vient changer quelque chose?
Oui, les changements qu'on a fait aujourd'hui ont des changements importants. Ce sont les changements pour améliorer l'environnement là, l'environnement physique et l'environnement battu là. Donc c'est très très important pour nous d'améliorer ces projets. Pour moi, c'est pas vraiment assez, mais c'est vrai que c'est absolument mieux que ce qu'on a vu semaine passée. Pour nous, c'est très très important qu'on a fait une communauté où tous les gens de communauté peuvent vivre une vie excellente. Et maintenant, on ne peut pas dire ça pour les communautés autochtones. Et donc, c'est très très important pour le conseil municipal de dire la vérité de ça et de faire des choses importantes, d'améliorer les vies de notre communauté autochtone.